What do a trunk, a telephone, and a pair of shoes have in common? You're about to find out in this Fun-Sized Felony. Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica, and this is a fun-sized felony. Before we begin, no felony is ever fun. When I say fun-sized, I mean the story is short, not that the crime itself was light or trivial, especially this one. In our last episode, we spent a great deal of time in Middleport, Ontario, Canada, the place where John Bartram, his brothers, his nieces, his mom, they all lived there at the time that John Heslop was murdered. In fact, the only reason that I even stumbled onto today's case is because I was searching for updates on John W. Lottridge's life after that trial. A man named John W. Lottridge appears in this story as a witness, which is why the story popped up. Is it the same man? I'm not entirely sure, but that's the question that led me here. Middleport sits along the Grand River, just north of the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. A significant Indigenous population lived in and around the town, and this case centers on members of that community. Emily Antone was a 38-year-old Indigenous woman. In July of 1912, she was beaten to death by her jealous boyfriend, John Bennett, a 27-year-old Indigenous man whose own half-brother had been hanged just 7 years earlier for murdering a woman in the very same way. Emily and John Bennett had a tumultuous relationship. They were on again, off again, and fought with the same intensity that drew them back together. Their love was volatile, and their conflicts were explosive. In 1876, Canada passed what was known as the Indian Act, which made it illegal for Indigenous people to possess or consume alcohol of any kind, either on or off the reserve. But as you heard in the John Heslop episode, people found ways around the law. At some point in early 1912, Emily Antone and John Bennett were caught with whiskey, charged, and convicted. Immediately afterward, they went their separate ways. Emily went to live near the town of Caledonia at the home of a man named King Fisher. And she started up an intimate relationship with him, which was something that John Bennett could not tolerate. Well, on Monday, July 15th, a man named Joe Axon was at his home in Middleport with his housekeeper, Susan Froman, who had worked for him for 7 months by this point. Susan Froman was Emily Antone's sister, so that's why Emily was heading here. That evening, just after 10 o'clock p.m., Emily Antone arrived by buggy with Constable Armour. Now, that is spelled A-R-M-O-U-R. Emily told Armour that she had a horse for sale out at Joe Axon's house, and he agreed to take a look at it to possibly purchase it from her. So he rode with Emily in her buggy out to the Axon home that night. In the buggy was a trunk full of Emily's belongings. Her plan was to return to her infant daughter who had been born earlier that year. And she actually had a husband who she was separated from, but she was living, this transient lifestyle, jumping from man to man. Things were pretty messy in her life. So she wanted to stop that. She wanted to go back to the reservation and just finally settle down. When Emily and Armour arrived at Axon's home, they were offered supper, and only afterward did Axon realize that they actually intended to stay the night. Constable Armour went to bed in one room, and then Susan took Emily upstairs to another, and then Susan and Joe went to bed in their own rooms. Now, at approximately 1 o'clock a.m., so now the day has turned to July 16th, John Bennett arrived, heavily intoxicated. He demanded to see Emily, and when he found her, it was nothing but horrible violence that ended in disaster. The whole story came out at the inquest, which was held on July 19th. Susan testified that neither Axon nor Armour had consumed alcohol that night, and she also said that she didn't believe Emily had been intoxicated. This, however, was disputed. There was a report that Emily had almost fallen out of her buggy 3 times on the way to the Axon residence due to being heavily inebriated. Now, it's possible that her sister didn't want to acknowledge that because it was actually a criminal offense for Indigenous people to have anything to do with alcohol. Susan stated she was awakened by a terrible noise around 1:00 a.m. When she reached the back door, she encountered John Bennett, who had just literally smashed the back door to pieces. She asked him what he wanted, and he replied, "I want that bitch." Susan tried to block him from the stairs to protect her sister, but he pushed past her and he wound up storming into the room where Emily was asleep. He woke Emily by shouting, "What the f*** do you mean by not doing as I told you?" Susan begged him not to hit Emily, but he hit her anyway, right in the mouth. Susan ran to the telephone to call for help, but the operator could not complete the connection. The operator would say, "Hold, please," and then the line would just be dead. Susan would try to call back, and sometimes the operator would just not answer, or the same thing would happen again. It would just be dead after the operator said that they would connect the call. She just could not get through. So while this was going on, Susan saw that Bennett was dragging Emily from the bedroom. Emily clung to Susan for help, but Bennett tore her away and shoved both of the women into the kitchen. While in the kitchen, he struck Emily several more times, and he even hit Susan in the back, and this knocked both of the women to the floor. Now, Joe Axon, he woke up. He heard this commotion. I don't know how you couldn't. And he came out of his room while John Bennett was dragging Emily from her bedroom. Constable Armour, however, never came out. The commotion was loud, okay? It was certainly loud enough to wake a sleeping man, yet there was no sign of the constable at all. Axon confronted Bennett and said, "John, you must not do that. This is my house," all of this stuff. He's trying to make this stop. And Bennett just kept swearing at him. Axon told Susan to try the phone again. So for over half an hour, she attempted to reach someone in Caledonia to try to find help, but she ran into the same problem. Either the operator couldn't successfully patch her through, or the operator wouldn't even answer the call. While Susan was on the phone trying to get this figured out, she heard Bennett slap Emily again multiple times and demand that she hurry and get her things on. When Susan returned to the room, Bennett was sitting by the stove, and Emily was half lying and half sitting on the sofa. Her eyes were closed, but she was still breathing. Susan was too afraid to approach her out of fear that Bennett might attack her. Well, at 3:00 in the morning, Bennett went over to Emily and he shook her, trying to wake her up. When she didn't respond, he said, "Oh, well, you can sleep then. I'm going to take the horse and you can walk home." He and Axon hitched the horse to the buggy and then Bennett left. So now Bennett's gone and Susan felt like it was finally safe. So she returned to bed. She slept until 10:00 that morning. Axon woke her and suggested that she get up and maybe make some breakfast for herself and Emily. So Susan got up and said she'd make some breakfast, and she asked Axon to go wake Emily up for her. Well, moments later, she hears him shout, "She's dead, Susan!" During the inquest, Susan was questioned about Constable Armour. He had remained upstairs in his room the entire time. She was asked why she hadn't summoned him. Why didn't she go and wake him up? There was a man of the law in the house. Now, I did not see any explanation for that at all. I would like to know that as well. She was trying desperately to call someone for help, but she could have just gone up and opened that door. So I'm not sure. Part of me thinks maybe he had been drinking and she knew that and knew he wouldn't have been any help, but I really don't know the answer to that. Susan explained that she spoke to Armour later, and he admitted to her that he had been awake, but he was too afraid of John Bennett to intervene. Doctors Frank and Palmer testified that Emily had been brutally beaten. A massive clot at the base of her brain caused her death, and it was the result of a single blow to the jaw that produced fatal hemorrhaging. The official cause of death was cervical hemorrhage. Now, as you know, Susan had attempted repeatedly to make a phone call for help. At the inquest, telephone operator Ida Armstrong testified that when she got on shift that day, which was later in the morning, she was given a little tag, and the tag said that there had been a couple calls that came in from the Axon residents, but over on the side of the tag, in the column for credit, was written, "Not good." Now, she explained that homes that were flagged as not good, operators were not supposed to connect calls for those homes. They were told not to do that. And so even though Susan was telling the operator there is a death in the house and a murder has been committed, even telling the operator these terrifying things, the operator would not put the call through on purpose.
What the hell?
Because Axon's home had bad credit. Now, later that morning, John W. Lottridge stopped by and learned that Emily was dead. He attempted to use the telephone, and he still couldn't get through either. So he went to 2 neighboring homes to see if he would have better luck on their phones, but they wouldn't allow him to even come in. He ultimately traveled all the way from Middleport to Onondaga, where he finally reached the coroner by phone at 2:00 p.m. Constable Armour was charged with dereliction of duty. Actually, scratch that. Go back. Ex-Constable Armour was charged with dereliction of duty. Yes, he was stripped of his badge. He lost his job because of this. Now, when he was asked why he hadn't intervened, he actually replied with, "Well, I hadn't my shoes with me." So essentially what he's saying is, I would have gone and tackled the guy, but I was in my socks. So unfortunately, the charge was dismissed. They had it all set up with a jury and everything, but what happened that night didn't fit perfectly within the definition of dereliction of duty. So they sent the jury home and had to dismiss the whole thing. But it turns out that ex-Constable Armour had actually been faced with similar charges in the past. And this guy had been a constable for 25 years. It's not like he was brand new, like just graduated from constable training, right? He'd been around the block. There's no excuse for this. John Bennett fled. Eventually, after a couple days, there was a reward of $200 offered, which way back in 1912 was worth a lot, and authorities believed he remained close to Middleport. They knew very well that he was just hiding on the reserve. They arrived at locations where he had been because people would call and say, he's at his dad's house, or, I saw him over here. So the authorities would arrive, and this happened a lot. It was in the papers a lot. They would show up and he wouldn't be there, but they'd say, oh, he was literally here like an hour ago. So he was always a step ahead of them. In January of 1914, so roughly 18 months after the murder, John Bennett was reportedly seen in Middleport. So he's off the reserve, he's in Middleport making purchases at a store, but they were unable to catch him again. In January of 1918, High County Constable Taylor stated that he had definite information that Bennett was somewhere out west. And that is the final time that John Bennett appears in print, ever. Emily Antone's death did not happen in isolation. It unfolded in a house full of people, under the watch of a system that failed her at every turn, through fear, indifference, bureaucracy, and silence. Phones rang unanswered. A constable literally stayed in bed and wouldn't even put his shoes on. And when morning came, the damage was already done. Emily Antone was laid to rest on Saturday, July 20th, 1912. The hunt for John Bennett went on for months upon months, and it was said that the officers who were involved in the hunt of John Bennett had worked harder on trying to find him than they had worked on anything else in their careers. And unfortunately, they came up with their hands empty. I feel like because there's no ending to this story, her story likely would never have been told. It's quite possible, since this was in 1912, and then her daughter, who had been born in 1912, passed away in 1929. I feel like Emily's story may be completely forgotten. People may not be talking about Emily at all, and what she went through, and the way that she suffered. So I feel honored to have been able to find this story and to bring her back to life. And that is that. That's the story of Emily Antone. This has been a Fun-Sized Felony.